They say the apostles left no gospel, that they taught but never wrote, that the true words of Jesus came only later from others. But what if that's a lie? What if all 12 apostles, not just Matthew or John, once penned a gospel together, a single book, a shared voice, a testimony written not in legend but in lived memory? And what if that gospel vanished, not by chance, but by decree, burned, buried, or banished? Not because it was false, but because it threatened the version of truth that came after. But tonight, you don't need to believe or reject. Just listen. Let the noise of the world quiet. Let the candles in your mind flicker on. The truth has waited centuries. It can wait a few more minutes while you settle into the stillness. You're about to follow a trail that winds through forbidden texts, heretical whispers, and the cracks in the church's own memory. There is no manuscript, no surviving scroll, just traces like smoke after fire. One early theologian mentions it in passing. Another condemns it without quoting it. Later, scribes hint at something strange, something once known, but now gone. A gospel used by heretics, they say. A fabrication. A danger. But why bother mentioning something that never mattered? Imagine the 12 gathered men who walked with Jesus, who saw the crucifixion, who fled and returned, and dared to speak again. What if they wrote it down not as myth, not as theology, but as record, together? And what if it said things the later church couldn't tolerate: a human Jesus, a Jewish Messiah, a gospel without Paul, not Roman enough, not divine enough, not controllable? This story is not about proving that gospel ever existed. It's about listening to the silence where it should have been, following the clues others dismissed, asking the questions that linger beneath centuries of curated faith. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. The first whispers come from the edge of orthodoxy, from the voices that would later be labeled as heretics, dissenters, corrupters of the true faith. But in the early centuries before the lines were drawn, those voices were often the ones preserving traditions older than their enemies cared to admit. That's where the earliest clues appear, not in golden scripted gospels or bishop-approved letters, but in the texts that survived, because someone forgot to burn them. In the 2nd century, scattered writings began to reference a gospel attributed not to an individual, but to the 12 apostles collectively. The very idea was radical, even dangerous. A gospel written by all 12 would carry an authority no later theologian could match. And yet we find it mentioned just once in a peculiar place, the lost writings of a Christian sect considered heretical by the developing church. Their texts didn't survive entirely, but quotations from their critics did. In the writings of early polemicists like Epiphanius and Origen, we find fleeting phrases, the gospel of the 12 used by heretics, not recognized by the churches. A name, a shadow, a warning. But what did these heretics believe that made their gospel so threatening? Many belonged to movements loosely grouped under the Gnostic umbrella: Valentinians, Scythians, Ebionites. Each held different views, often contradictory. But some of them claimed that a gospel had been passed down not just from a single apostle, but from the collective tradition of the 12. One obscure text, known only through hostile commentary, claimed that its teachings came from the men who walked with the Lord. At this point, you might pause and wonder, could this be a misunderstanding? Perhaps the Gospel of the 12 was simply another name for one of the known Gospels, Matthew, for instance, which already claims an apostolic pedigree. But the way the early critics describe it, always with caution, always with distance, suggests something different. They don't explain it. They dismiss it. That silence is telling. After all, the easiest way to bury a dangerous document isn't to attack it. It's to erase the context, let it fade, and accuse those who mention it of madness or heresy. There's a curious passage in a surviving Gnostic text, the Gospel of the Egyptians, which itself was nearly lost, that refers cryptically to teachings from the Circle of the 12. It doesn't name the document, but it echoes the same formula used by others who claim to preserve a gospel born not of Paul's letters or Greek philosophy, but of direct apostolic memory. Even stranger are the linguistic fingerprints. Several heretical texts that reference secret teachings or alternative gospels share unusual terminology phrases not found in the canonical gospels, but repeated across disparate works. Terms like the luminous man, the father of silence, and the first voice appear in texts attributed to different sects. It's as if they were drawing from a shared source now lost. Could that source have been a gospel written, or at least inspired by the 12? We also find thematic oddities. In certain Gnostic writings, Jesus is portrayed not as the crucified Savior, but as a revealer of hidden wisdom who departs before the crucifixion. Some scholars have argued that these ideas were late inventions. But others have asked more cautiously, what if they were early ones? What if the so-called heretics weren't innovating but preserving something that didn't make it into the final cut? Something that once had the 12's approval, but not Rome's. Of course, none of this proves anything. But the pattern is strange. Why do so many condemned texts mention teachings attributed to all 12? Why does the phrase Gospel of the 12 survive only in hostile footnotes? Why is the text itself, if it ever existed, completely gone, while other heretical writings managed to limp into history through fragments? This is where scholars today still argue. Was there ever a single gospel written by the 12, or is the phrase a misunderstanding, a poetic embellishment, or a polemical fiction? Could it have been a nickname for another known text? Or was it something real, now missing not by accident, but by elimination? The only thing we know for sure is this: the term existed. Someone somewhere used it, and someone else felt the need to erase it. That tug of war between memory and censorship, between reverence and control, is the thread we'll keep following. Earlier you heard the name Origen, a church father, whose writings have both preserved and puzzled historians. He'll return soon in our story, with his own cryptic remarks about this gospel. But even before Origen, the fact that heretical texts invoked the 12 as authors tells us something about authority. In a world flooded with competing visions of Jesus, attaching your gospel to the 12 wasn't just a theological move, it was a political one. And as we've seen throughout religious history, the more dangerous the political implications, the faster the evidence tends to vanish. You drift now into the 3rd century, where the air grows heavier with dogma, and the boundaries of acceptable belief start hardening like wet cement turning to stone. At the center of this tightening world stands a brilliant, tireless theologian, Origen of Alexandria, a man of contradictions, of radical thought and unwavering devotion. He fasted, prayed, and mutilated his own body to conquer desire, yet wrote so prolifically that his words became both pillars and thorns in the early church. It is from Origen that we receive one of the most perplexing crumbs in the trail. In his commentary on the canonical Gospel of Luke, Origen pauses almost offhandedly to mention a text he calls the Gospel according to the 12. He gives no description, no quote, no context, just a name as if it needed no explanation, as if everyone reading already knew. That's the moment the room falls quiet. The ink settles. The silence speaks. He says the gospel was used by heretics. That alone was enough to cast suspicion in his time. But he doesn't call it a forgery. He doesn't call it absurd. He doesn't say it was written by enemies of Christ, just that it existed, that some people used it, and then he moves on. Scholars today still debate what Origen meant. Was he referring to the Ebionites, the Jewish Christians who rejected Paul and may have clung to older traditions? Was it a scribal error, a misremembered title? Or did Origen, for all his orthodoxy, know of a gospel he didn't dare explore in public? And here's the kicker. Origen didn't shy away from controversy. He debated eternal souls, cosmic reincarnation, and allegorical scripture with a confidence that made even his allies nervous. If he'd wanted to denounce the gospel of the 12 outright, he would have. But he didn't. He let it hang, like a curtain half drawn. It's tempting to dismiss this as a footnote, but that one reference buried in a sprawling commentary holds weight precisely because of who said it. Origen's library in Caesarea, perhaps the most extensive Christian archive of its time, would have given him access to texts no longer surviving today. He had scrolls, codices, testimonies now reduced to ash or buried beneath monasteries that forgot what they were hiding. What Origen doesn't say is as strange as what he does. He doesn't quote the gospel. He doesn't explain why it's heretical. He doesn't link it to any known sect, despite his deep familiarity with heterodox movements. It's as if he's tiptoeing or perhaps whispering a name too dangerous to speak aloud. There's another detail, small but chilling. Origen often uses a similar rhetorical strategy. When referencing banned ideas, mention them briefly, then immediately pivot to something else, as if throwing up a cloud of dust. It's a dance with orthodoxy, one he'd perfected long before the Church labeled some of his own views heretical after his death. That kind of maneuvering suggests he was aware of boundaries he dared not cross too openly. The question that lingers isn't whether Origen believed in the gospel of the 12, it's whether he saw it with his own eyes, held it, read it, quoted it in a sermon that no longer survives. And if he did, why let it vanish? This leads to a second, quieter question. If Origen mentioned it, who else knew his students, his fellow theologians? Did anyone else read the same text and choose to say nothing? The mystery deepens when we remember that Origen's writings weren't preserved haphazardly. They were copied, edited, redacted, sometimes softened, sometimes censored. There's even evidence that later scribes altered or omitted controversial passages from his commentaries. What if there was more to his mention? What if the full commentary once included a description, a quote, a condemnation? And what if someone later on, with ink-stained fingers and a silent mandate, decided that it was better left erased? The possibility isn't far-fetched. We know this happened. We know church scribes actively removed ideas they deemed dangerous. One late manuscript of Origen's First Principles contains entire paragraphs blacked out or rewritten. If they could erase his beliefs about universal salvation, why not his passing remark about a gospel too fragile to survive sunlight? It's here that we must recall the earlier hints, the heretical texts that reference teachings from the 12, the shared terminology, the echoes. If those texts drew from a now-lost source, then Origen's mention isn't an outlier, it's a confirmation. A ghost flickering in two mirrors at once. And still we cannot say with certainty what this gospel contained, or even if it ever existed in the form imagined by later writers. But what we can say with a whisper of confidence is that Origen knew the name, that he passed it on deliberately or not, and that the Church somewhere along the line chose to say nothing more. As you let this settle, remember that even silence is an editorial choice. Erasure is not forgetfulness, it is strategy. And in the early centuries, when theology could mean death to know of a dangerous gospel and speak its name was already a kind of rebellion. Origen's scholar of scholars whispered its name once. That whisper still echoes. As the 4th century dawns, the debate over sacred texts begins to calcify into something more formidable: canon. The loose, flexible bookshelf of early Christianity starts to take the shape of a fortress, with walls meant to keep certain ideas in and others out. At the gates of that fortress stands Eusebius of Caesarea, bishop historian, and one of the first great architects of Christian memory. If Origen left a whisper, Eusebius brings the hammer. His ecclesiastical history is nothing short of a foundational text, part history, part theology, part propaganda. In it, Eusebius attempts something unprecedented. He categorizes Christian writings into 3 groups: those accepted, those disputed, and those rejected entirely as heretical. He doesn't merely list books. He weighs them, approves them, exiles them. And though he never outright names the Gospel of the 12, the space it would have occupied is chillingly clear. In the rejected pile, he places texts like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of the Egyptians, and others he says are altogether absurd and impious. But his language becomes slipperier when he speaks of books used by heretics, even if they once claimed apostolic origin. This is where things become interesting. For one moment, Eusebius refers to a group of texts falsely attributed to apostles. A vague phrase, but one that raises a question: were some Gospels rejected not because of their content, but because of their authorship or lack of control over it? Eusebius is no neutral librarian. He writes under imperial favor just as Christianity is beginning to wrap itself in purple robes. The canon he promotes isn't just about truth, it's about stability. A gospel written by the 12, if it ever existed, would have wielded unimaginable authority. That kind of authority had to be carefully assigned, funneled, contained. A gospel from Matthew safe, from John useful, but one that claimed the collective voice of the entire apostolic group. Too dangerous, too unmanageable, too democratic. It's telling that Eusebius's categorization doesn't rest entirely on theology. He leans heavily on provenance. Where did the book come from? Who used it? Was it cited by reliable bishops? And crucially, was it used by heretics? That single criterion was often enough to seal a text's fate. If a gospel was beloved by Gnostics, Ebionites, or others on the wrong side of ecclesial politics, it was immediately suspect no matter what it said. This logic creates a neat little paradox. A book could be rejected because heretics used it, even if the heretics used it because it was ancient and close to the source. If the Gospel of the 12 circulated among fringe Jewish Christian groups, it would have met this exact fate, judged guilty by association. And then there's the curious case of the so-called Apostolic memoirs, a phrase used by multiple church fathers to describe the earliest gospel traditions. Eusebius himself refers to these memoirs, but doesn't specify which texts he means. Could the Gospel of the 12 have once been lumped into this vague category, recognized, respected, but eventually deemed too unruly for canon? In this light, his omission becomes louder than a denial. Had he named the Gospel of the 12, he would have had to account for it. Better perhaps to let it vanish quietly, to let it blend into the fog of heretical writings that no bishop needed to examine too closely. After all, by the time of Eusebius, to even acknowledge the value of a forbidden text was to risk suspicion yourself. And so, like a door closed and bricked over the Gospel of the 12 may have been buried behind Eusebius's categorization, not by flames or riots, but by footnotes, by strategic forgetting. The canon was being built, and there was no room for a text that didn't follow the new blueprint. What makes this moment even more unsettling is the backdrop against which it occurred. Constantine had just legalized Christianity. The empire was watching. Unity was the new priority, and unity in the Roman imagination never included 12 different voices singing at once. So if a gospel existed that captured those voices early, raw, contradictory, unfiltered, it had to go. And Eusebius, ever the organizer, likely knew exactly what it meant to leave certain things unsaid. The irony, of course, is that his effort to tidy the Christian bookshelf left behind a different kind of mess, gaps, absences, mysteries. Like that strange mention by Origen. Like the recurring references in banned texts. Like the faint, insistent idea that something is missing, something older than the Gospels we know. And as you let these shadows settle around you, imagine Eusebius in his study, quill in hand, deciding which stories would be remembered, and which ones would be removed so thoroughly that only their names and their danger would remain. He may not have burned the Gospel of the 12, but he built the world where it couldn't survive. You've heard their names 1,000 times, Peter, James, John, Thomas, and the others, like flickering silhouettes against the candlelit wall of Christian tradition. They walked with Jesus. They watched him die. They claimed to see him again. They preached. They bled. They vanished. But what did they actually leave behind in writing? Not stories about them, not hagiographies written decades later, not vague traditions, actual documents, ink on parchment, anything at all. This is where things begin to blur. You might assume, given their central role, that the 12 left volumes. But open the New Testament and look closely. Only a handful of books claim apostolic authorship directly, and fewer still withstand scrutiny. Peter is credited with 2 epistles, though most scholars agree only one may be authentic. John is tied to a gospel, 3 letters, and the Apocalypse, though again, the identities of these Johns multiply like reflections in water. James, brother of Jesus, is there, but not one of the 12. And Paul, whose voice echoes most loudly, was not among them. So where are they, the men who were supposed to be eyewitnesses? Did they write nothing at all, or did someone else decide what counted as theirs? Some early traditions say the apostles preached orally and relied on scribes. Others suggest they intentionally avoided writing things down, preferring the immediacy of speech and memory. But then, curiously, we see fragments, tiny shards of attribution, scattered in the sands of early Christianity. The Gospel of Thomas claims to contain the secret sayings of the living Jesus, as recorded by Didymus Judas Thomas. The Gospel of Peter makes bold claims of first-hand witness, even if it ultimately failed the sniff test of early church approval. The Acts of Andrew, the preaching of Bartholomew, the Epistle of the Apostles, all texts later deemed apocryphal, yet all anchored to one or more members of the 12. It's almost as if the apostles' authority was so desirable, so irresistible, that everyone wanted a piece of it, especially after they were gone. And that's precisely where the trouble starts. When every scribe in every region starts writing in the name of how do you separate legacy from forgery, here's where the Gospel of the 12, if it ever existed, stands apart. Unlike individual Gospels attributed to single apostles, this one was said to come from all of them. A collective voice, a unified account. If true, it would outrank every other source. No bishop, no theologian, no evangelist could speak louder than that. But that's also what made it so dangerous. Imagine a text where all 12 confirmed teachings that conflicted with later doctrines say the full humanity of Jesus, or a purely Jewish messianism, or a total absence of Trinitarian language. It wouldn't just be problematic. It would be a liability. There's an eerie moment in the Epistle of the Apostles, a 2nd-century text, claiming to preserve the unified teaching of the 12. Though not accepted into the canon, it circulates widely and emphasizes communal witness, shared instruction, and a Jesus who speaks plainly, not mystically. Scholars have debated whether this text was based on an earlier lost gospel. It's filled with oddities, anti-Gnostic rants, strange resurrection narratives, and an almost desperate insistence that this is what we really said. It reads like a corrective or perhaps a replacement for something else, something more original. Could it be that the Church allowed this sanitized epistle to circulate precisely because the real gospel of the 12 was too volatile, that this cleaned-up version was permitted to exist in its place, like a wax figure replacing a missing king? And then there are the traditions of apostolic preaching preserved in early catechetical formulas. You'll hear whispers of what the apostles taught passed down orally through bishops and teachers, often without attribution to any written document. Some of these creeds show surprising simplicity. Others sound suspiciously like they were retrofitted to match evolving orthodoxy. But the question remains, was there ever a written core behind these floating declarations? And if so, where did it go? We return now to that haunting silence around the 12, so central in the early church, yet so absent in authorship. It doesn't add up. Unless something was removed, unless a voice once shouted and was then deliberately silenced. And here's where you pause again, drifting through the implications. If such a gospel once existed and truly reflected the teachings of the 12 as a body, what would it have said? Would it have looked anything like the Gospels we know? Would it have included parables, miracles, or would it have focused on ethics, prophecy, the kingdom of God, without the heavy machinery of later theology? You begin to see why such a text would terrify early church leaders, not just because of what it said, but because of who it claimed to be. A gospel with that kind of authority couldn't be argued with, only buried. So what did the apostles leave behind? A few letters, a few echoes, and possibly one gospel too dangerous to survive. The room narrows now, drawing your attention to a torn, brittle scrap of Latin discovered in the 18th century, but far older than the ink that catalogued it. It's called the Muratorian fragment, and despite its incomplete beginning and uneven phrasing, it's one of the earliest surviving attempts to define the Christian canon. Dated to the late 2nd century, it reads like the minutes of a secret meeting, hurried, uncertain, filled with both bold declarations and awkward omissions. This fragment lists the books that were considered acceptable in some Christian communities at the time. It includes familiar names, Luke, John, Acts, but not all of them. Notably, it excludes letters now found in the New Testament and includes others that were later cast out. Among its more curious features is a quick mention of the Apocalypse of Peter, accepted by some of us. And then this strange footnote about the shepherd of Hermas, a popular text that the fragment praises but ultimately disqualifies because it was written very recently. That phrase alone opens a chasm of questions. If newness disqualified a book, then age conferred authority. But what of texts older than Hermas ones potentially linked to the apostles themselves that are missing altogether? What, for instance, of a gospel attributed to the 12? Here the silence is sharp. The gospel of the 12 is nowhere in the fragment, not praised, not condemned, not even mentioned. And yet many scholars have puzzled over the strange omissions. Where is the Gospel of Matthew? Where is Hebrews? Where are the texts that would later become central to orthodoxy? Some suggest the original beginning of the fragment has been lost. Others argue the compiler was working from a regional tradition, not a universal canon. Either way, the list feels unstable, provisional, like a snapshot of a bookshelf still being rearranged. But then comes the question that makes your breath pause. If this is a list of books known and considered, what does it mean when something is absent? There are only a few possibilities. It was unknown. It was dismissed. Or it was known and already deemed too dangerous to name. Throughout the fragment, there's a sharp defensiveness. The compiler seems aware of disputes, actively arguing against certain books, defending others. This is not a relaxed inventory. It's a canon under construction, scaffolding, trembling in the wind. And in that storm, a gospel attributed to all 12 apostles would have been either a crown jewel or a direct threat to every theological brick being laid. Imagine the problem it posed. If such a gospel contradicted the writings of Paul, already dominant in many communities, what then if it portrayed Jesus not as a pre-existent logos, but as a chosen, anointed human being, fully Jewish in thought and deed? Where would that leave the delicate balance of emerging orthodoxy? A gospel bearing the collective signature of the 12 would supersede. Paul challenged the later gospel writers and destabilize the very hierarchy that bishops were trying to consolidate. And there's another layer. In some early Christian circles, including those represented by the Muratorian list, a clear effort emerges to sever ties with Jewish Christian groups that still honored the Torah, still saw Jesus as a reformer rather than a replacement. A gospel written by Jewish apostles for a Jewish audience with Jewish messianic expectations might have appeared regressive, an echo of the movement before it was Romanized, before it was safe. The Muratorian fragment in this light becomes a study in selectivity. It's a canon curated not just by theology but by fear. And what isn't mentioned may be more important than what is. You recall now Origen's mention, the heretical citations, the pattern of erasure. If the Gospel of the 12 had survived into the 2nd century, as some clues suggest, the compilers of this fragment would likely have known of it. And if they didn't include it, not even to condemn it, that silence may not be ignorance. It may be concealment. We've already seen how Eusebius wielded categorization like a sword. But the Muratorian compiler, whoever they were, worked earlier in a world still full of contested texts and whispered gospels. In that chaos, deciding what not to list may have been just as powerful as deciding what to include. The absence of the Gospel of the 12 from this fragment is not proof of its existence, but it is strangely a kind of presence, like a painting where a figure has been erased, but the outline remains, the blank space shouting louder than the color around it. As the candles flicker and your breath evens out, you feel it again, that tension between what survives and what vanishes, and how sometimes history isn't written by the victors, but preserved by the silences they leave behind. You know the feeling when 4 witnesses tell the same story, but their details don't quite match. That's how the canonical Gospels often read. 4 windows into the same life, but each one tinted differently. Matthew gives you prophecy fulfilled. Mark moves fast and keeps it raw. Luke adds polish and empathy. John wanders into mysticism. But between them lies a quiet dissonance, timelines out of sync, parables, reshaped characters who say one thing in one gospel and another in the next. For centuries, this puzzled theologians. Then someone had an idea. What if there was once a bridge, a gospel, that connected them all, now gone? Enter the ancient theory of the Proto-gospel. A source text, the missing link. Scholars have long speculated about something called Q, from the German Quell, meaning source, an earlier collection of sayings that Matthew and Luke may have drawn from. But Q is hypothetical. No copy has ever been found, and yet the idea of a shared origin lingers in academic circles like incense in a stone chapel. Now shift the frame slightly. What if the mysterious bridge between the Gospels wasn't Q, but the Gospel of the 12, a text that unified their memories, their testimony, their language. Not a sayings collection, but a narrative. And what if over time that gospel fractured into pieces absorbed by others, rewritten to fit new agendas, until only its silhouette remained stretched across four gospels that couldn't agree on how many women went to the tomb or what Jesus' last words were? Consider this: if a collective gospel once existed, it might explain why certain episodes appear across multiple gospels with nearly identical wording, yet slightly different emphasis. It might explain why certain parables appear in one gospel and vanish from the next. It might even explain the structural harmony beneath the surface chaos, why Matthew and Luke follow Mark so closely, and yet sometimes diverge in ways that feel rehearsed, not random. There's a curious passage in Papias, a 2nd century bishop, who claimed that Matthew put the sayings of Jesus in order in Hebrew. Scholars have argued over whether he meant our Gospel of Matthew or something else entirely, perhaps an earlier version, perhaps a different text. Some even suggest he was referencing a gospel written not by one man, but by the group, the 12. A gospel written in the apostles' own tongue, then translated, fragmented, repackaged. We also see attempts at harmony throughout the early centuries. The Diatessaron, compiled by Tatian in the 2nd century, stitches together the four canonical Gospels into a single narrative. But why would anyone do that, unless there had once been a model? Unless the idea of a unified gospel endorsed by the 12 was already embedded in the Church's DNA? And if that model existed and was later rejected, its traces may survive not in direct quotations, but in the friction between the texts we now call sacred. The places where they overlap awkwardly. The contradictions no council ever fully resolved. But here's the twist. If such a gospel ever served as a foundation, it likely didn't look like the polished texts we know today. It may have been raw, less concerned with theology, more with memory. Stories told around campfires, fragments of sermons. A man who broke bread, wept, bled, and walked again. Not yet divine, not yet a symbol. Just Jesus. That kind of text wouldn't serve the needs of empire. It wouldn't lend itself to doctrinal clarity. It wouldn't answer the hard questions about nature and substance and eternal generation. It would simply speak through 12 voices what they saw. And that's precisely why it had to be replaced. As the Church grew, it needed texts that could align with councils' creeds and eventually Constantine's approval. It needed to unify across geography, language, and power. A gospel written by the 12 may have been too rooted in the earliest, messiest phase of the movement, too Jewish, too oral, too human. So it was either edited beyond recognition or discarded, but not entirely forgotten. Because something about the four Gospels we have, especially when placed side by side, feels like a puzzle missing its original box. You can see the picture forming, but the edges don't quite fit. And in that awkward gap, the shadow of a lost gospel lingers. It may not have survived as a scroll, but it may still echo in the ways Matthew mirrors Mark, or how Luke softens Matthew, or how John tells a story no one else dares to. So as you lie still listening to these threads weave together, consider that the bridge between the Gospels may not have been a theory, but a memory. And memories, when dangerous, are always the first to be erased. Some Gospels were never lost. They were just gently pushed aside. Others were buried more thoroughly beneath layers of doctrinal mud, wrapped in warnings, or preserved only through the hostile words of those who wanted them forgotten. And then there's the Gospel of the Hebrews. Neither fully lost nor ever fully welcomed, it drifts through early Christian history like a ghost with no grave. And if you listen closely, you might hear it whisper something older. maybe even something that once belonged to the 12. The Gospel of the Hebrews is an elusive creature. It doesn't survive in full. Instead, we meet it in fragments, quotes, summaries, and passing references from church fathers who read it, remembered it, and then tossed it aside like an inconvenient guest. Jerome, that fiery translator of the Vulgate, claimed to have seen a copy in the library of Caesarea, possibly the same one Origen once used. He found it strange sometimes, beautiful occasionally, suspect. Others, like Clement and Origen himself, refer to it with guarded familiarity, as though it were a text one couldn't endorse, but also couldn't quite ignore. Its exact contents are a patchwork Jesus saying that the Holy Spirit is his mother, the resurrected Christ appearing to James, a moment where Jesus affirms the value of Jewish customs. It reads differently, less Greek, more Semitic, less philosophical, more rooted in the soil of Palestine. And that's the detail worth holding on to. This gospel smells of dust sandals and Galilean hills, not of Alexandria or Rome. Some scholars believe the Gospel of the Hebrews was a version of Matthew written in Hebrew or Aramaic. Others suggest it was an independent text entirely related to the Gospels of the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, all of which may have drawn from the same early Jewish Christian source. That's where the speculation thickens. What if that shared source was the Gospel of the 12? Or what if the Gospel of the Hebrews was itself a late adaptation of it, preserved by communities who were never fully absorbed into the Gentile church? There are reasons to wonder. For one, this Gospel seems to reflect a memory of Jesus that predates heavy doctrinal construction. He teaches, he heals, he honors the law. There is no Trinity, no Pauline theology, no cosmic logos descending from eternity. Just a man deeply Jewish, offering wisdom and warning. If that was the version of Jesus the 12 preserved in their gospel, it would explain a great deal, especially why later councils preferred to treat this text like a family secret. We also find buried in Jerome's accounts a few curious lines where Jesus speaks directly to the 12 not just as individuals, but as a group. In one quote, he tells them, "Never be joyful except when you look upon your brother with love." It's simple, human, unadorned, and eerily close in tone to certain sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. Not coincidentally, another text often linked to lost oral traditions. The problem, of course, is that we'll never know for certain whether the Gospel of the Hebrews was derived from, inspired by, or merely adjacent to the Gospel of the 12. But the shape of it, its theology, its language, its Jewishness, fits the silhouette of what such a gospel might have looked like. And there's a final clue tucked into a note by Epiphanius. He claimed that some Jewish Christians used a gospel according to the 12, and others used the Gospel of the Hebrews. He doesn't say they were the same, but he places them side by side. That's enough to make the mind wander. Could it be that these texts weren't entirely separate? That they were branches from a common trunk, an early gospel tradition maintained outside of Rome, nurtured by believers who never surrendered their Jewish identity, who still saw Jesus as prophet, teacher, Messiah, not metaphysical redeemer? It's possible. And if true, it would make the Gospel of the Hebrews not merely an oddity, but a survivor. A weathered, altered echo of something older, clearer, and collectively authored. You return now to that image of Origen's library, dusty, crowded, filled with texts that no longer exist. You imagine a scroll labeled Gospel according to the Hebrews lying beside another with a more dangerous title. Perhaps written in the same hand. Perhaps not. But when opened, maybe the stories sounded eerily alike. The difference, one was preserved in fragments. The other was erased entirely. Now dim the lights further and follow the scent of something sharper, something that split the church long before any council could mend it. His name was Marcion, a shipbuilder's son from Pontus, a theologian by obsession and a heretic by almost every account. But long before Rome called him a threat, he called attention to something no one wanted to hear, that the message of Jesus had already been rewritten. Marcion arrived in Rome around 140 CE, carrying money ideas and a version of the gospel that shocked even the flexible boundaries of early Christianity. He preached that the God of Jesus was not the God of the Old Testament, that the Hebrew Scriptures revealed a lower legalistic deity, while Jesus revealed a God of pure love, previously unknown. It was a theological Molotov cocktail, and it came with its own canon. Marcion's gospel wasn't Matthew, Mark, or even John. It was a stripped-down version of Luke, edited lean, purged of anything too Jewish. Gone were the genealogies, the infancy stories, the fulfilled prophecies. What remained was a gospel tailored to his theology, a clean break from the past. No Hebrew baggage, no muddled messianism, just the words of Jesus curated to fit the image of a Savior unchained from tradition. It caused chaos, and it also raised a troubling possibility, one the church couldn't unsee. If Marcion could edit the gospel to match his theology, who's to say others hadn't done the same, or worse? What if others had edited to erase something more original? Something too Jewish, too messy, too communal, something like the Gospel of the 12. There's a theory, quiet, persistent, unsettling, that the Marcionite controversy didn't just provoke theological rebuttals, but editorial action. That the Church's rapid canon formation, its sudden drive to declare which texts were authentic, was in part a reaction to Marcion's bold move. He rewrote the Gospel. The Church, in turn, may have rewritten it again. If the Gospel of the 12 existed, if it ever circulated even in fragments, it would have been especially vulnerable in this climate. Imagine a text that presented Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish hopes, not the abolisher of them. A gospel where the 12 teach continuity, not rupture. In a world where Marcion had just declared war on the Hebrew God, such a text wouldn't merely be inconvenient. It would be explosive. Some scholars argue that Marcion's gospel wasn't entirely original, that he may have drawn from earlier, now lost traditions. And that's where the trail grows warm. Because in rejecting everything, Jewish Marcion may have been reacting not just to the Hebrew Scriptures, but to a strain of Christian teaching that still honored them. A strain possibly preserved in something like the Gospel of the 12. And the pushback was fierce. Within decades, the Church begins emphasizing the authority of 4 Gospels. No more, no less. By the time of Irenaeus, the number is sacred. He compares the fourfold gospel to the 4 winds, the 4 corners of the earth, as if the idea itself had come from heaven. But it hadn't. It came from necessity, from a desperate need to draw boundaries. And what do you do with a gospel that doesn't fit? You don't burn it in the town square that creates martyrs. You don't quote it in your rebuttals that gives it breath. You ignore it. You let it die of silence, or you absorb it. Take what's useful. Spread it thin across safer texts. Some scholars have noted that the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, share a structural spine that suggests coordination. Not plagiarism, but perhaps preservation. Perhaps even memory. Memory of a more unified gospel, fragmented not by accident but on purpose. And here's a curious echo: Marcion's gospel, while edited, contains themes that seem strangely early. Jesus as a teacher of radical mercy, a savior who confronts religious hypocrisy without calling down fire. These elements align not just with Luke, but with stories that pop up in extra-canonical texts, ones that may stem from even older traditions. perhaps traditions Marcion adapted or tried to overwrite. It becomes a hall of mirrors, a gospel edited to erase Jewishness, triggering the elevation of gospels edited to preserve it, but in Roman terms. And somewhere in that maze, the gospel of the 12 vanishes. Not because it lost a fight, but because it wasn't allowed to enter the ring. As your breath slows and the flicker of that ancient controversy fades, imagine a version of Christianity that could have emerged had different texts survived. Imagine a gospel written by 12 men who knew Jesus not as idea, but as friend. What would they have said? What would they have emphasized? And what would they have been willing to die to protect? The waves are gentler now, but deceptive because beneath them lies one of the strangest currents in early Christian literature. Not a gospel, not quite an epistle, not officially anything at all, and yet sprawling, intricate, and deeply unsettling in what it suggests. These are the Pseudo-Clementines, a pair of 2nd and 3rd century texts known as the Recognitions and the Homilies. At first glance, they read like religious fiction, dramatic dialogues, secret teachings, long philosophical debates. But something about them feels different, older, almost apologetically preserved. They claim to tell the story of Clement, a Roman nobleman turned disciple of Peter, and his travels with the apostle across the ancient world. But hidden within this pious narrative are ideas that scholars still whisper about. A gospel that doesn't quite match the canon. Teachings that echo Jewish Christian thought, and most curiously, multiple references to a tradition preserved not by Paul, not by Gentile bishops, but by the 12 themselves. One of the most revealing passages involves a confrontation between Peter and Simon Magus, the infamous magician often portrayed as Christianity's first heretic. In the homilies, Peter debates Simon not with epistles, not with philosophical abstractions, but by appealing to the true teachings handed down by the 12. He insists that the apostles, not Paul, are the reliable interpreters of Jesus' message. That may seem unremarkable until you remember that this text was written in a world already dominated by Paul's letters. And yet here, Paul is never named, only referred to obliquely, even critically, as the enemy who misunderstood Christ. Some scholars have suggested that the Pseudo-Clementines contain veiled critiques of Pauline theology. Others go further, proposing that the authors had access to an alternative apostolic tradition, a gospel that predated Paul's influence entirely. Could this have been the gospel of the 12? The thematic clues are compelling. The text emphasizes the oneness of God, the fulfillment, not rejection, of the law, and the idea that Jesus came not to start a new religion, but to restore a corrupted one. These are not Pauline ideas. They belong to the earliest layer of the movement, the layer most associated with the original disciples. The 12. More than that, the Pseudo-Clementines repeatedly insist that secret teachings were passed directly from Jesus to the apostles, and preserved only by those who remained faithful to the original path. In one dialogue, Peter warns that false teachers have created gospels that twist the truth for their own ends, and that only those grounded in the apostolic tradition can discern the real message. He even mentions that certain teachings were kept hidden from public view, entrusted only to those ready to receive them. It's here that the possibility begins to stir. What if the Gospel of the 12 wasn't just one document? What if it was a body of teachings, some written, some oral, guarded by early Jewish Christian communities, who never fully merged with Gentile orthodoxy, that would explain why we never find a manuscript? Why Origen only mentions it in passing? Why Eusebius leaves a hole where its name should be? It wasn't a bestseller. It was a blueprint handed from one group to the next, protected by communities increasingly labeled as heretical. And here's a detail too odd to ignore: the Pseudo-Clementines include a scene where Peter accuses others of creating new scriptures and planting them among the genuine ones. It's a rare moment of meta-commentary, where the text itself questions the integrity of the canon. It doesn't name names, it doesn't shout, but it whispers something explosive, that what we have today may not be what was once given. Of course, the Pseudo-Clementines are complicated. Later interpolations muddy their origins, their theology wavers, their language blends Jewish and Greek styles. And yet that tension is precisely what makes them important. They seem to be wrestling with something older, trying to preserve it in a world no longer friendly to it. If the Gospel of the 12 had been lost by this point, the Pseudo-Clementines may be among the last witnesses to its voice, not quoting it, but echoing it, embedding its worldview, its priorities, its suspicion of Paul, its emphasis on direct apostolic witness. They are not proof, but they are footprints. And if you lean in closely with the lights low and the noise gone, you might hear what they were trying to keep alive. A memory, a message, a gospel that was never fully gone, just rewritten in shadows. There's a wind that blows through the forgotten corners of early Christianity, carrying with it the scent of sandals, Sabbath meals, and a Jesus who looked nothing like the glowing figure in stained glass. That wind is the voice of the Ebionites, an early Jewish Christian group, shunned by both the church and the synagogue, but holding on to something that may lead us closer to the Gospel of the 12. The Ebionites were peculiar even among the early sects. They believed Jesus was the Messiah, but not divine. Born of a man and woman chosen by God at his baptism, filled with the Spirit, but never part of a trinity. They rejected Paul, entirely calling him an apostate from the law. They followed Torah. They revered James, the brother of Jesus. And most striking of all, they used a gospel, not one we know today, but one they claimed came from the apostles themselves. Church fathers describe this gospel in suspicious tones. Epiphanius, never one to miss a chance to label something heretical, called it the Gospel of the Hebrews, or in some manuscripts, the Gospel of the 12. He claimed the Ebionites had edited Matthew's Gospel, removing the birth narrative, the virgin birth, and everything too mystical or divine. But others weren't so sure. Some suggested that what the Ebionites used wasn't a redacted gospel, but a preserved one older than the canon, rooted in the oral teachings of the 12. And here's the strangest part. In several patristic writings, the Ebionites are accused not of inventing new doctrines, but of clinging too closely to old ones. They were seen as stubborn, regressive, unwilling to evolve. They were, in other words, living fossils of the Jesus movement before it became Christianity. So the question rises, like incense, was their gospel a distortion or a memory? One of the fragments attributed to the Ebionite gospel records a line from Jesus: "I have come to abolish the sacrifices, and if you do not cease from sacrificing, wrath will not cease from you." It's not something you'd find in the canon, but it fits the tone of a reformer, someone steeped in Jewish tradition, yet pushing against its ossified institutions. It feels early, raw, something you might expect if the 12 had written about the Jesus they knew, not the Christ, later theologians debated. There's also a logistical echo worth noting. If the Gospel of the 12 ever existed, where would it have survived longest? Not in the imperial churches of Rome or Constantinople, but in the margins, among communities that were crushed, dispersed, or simply left out. Communities like the Ebionites. Their gospel, whatever its original name, emphasized Jesus as teacher-prophet and Torah-observant Messiah. It lacked the sweeping metaphysics of John, the rhetorical complexity of Paul, and the creeds that would come centuries later. It was simpler. and simplicity in this case might point backward. Church fathers hated it, which is oddly enough promising. When men like Irenaeus, Epiphanius, and Origen took the time to attack something, it usually meant it had real traction. The Ebionites wouldn't die out easily. They lingered in Syria and Palestine well into the 4th century, stubbornly holding on to their gospel, even as the rest of the Christian world moved on. There are open questions here, of course. Were the Ebionites the last custodians of a gospel the 12 once knew, or were they just one of many groups rewriting the Jesus story to fit their theology? The problem is we don't have their gospel. We have accusations about it, snippets, paraphrases, hostile reconstructions, and always the sense that something crucial has been left out. But consider the constellation we're beginning to see. Origen's mention of a gospel of the 12, Eusebius's suspicious silence, the absence in the Muratorian list, the echo in the Gospel of the Hebrews, and now a group of Jewish Christians cut off from the mainstream clinging to a text that might have been born from the mouths of the original apostles. If the Gospel of the 12 survived in any form, the Ebionites may have been its final guardians, not because they forged it, but because they refused to let it go. And perhaps that's why they too had to vanish. Imagine for a moment a Christianity without Paul. No letters to the Corinthians. No thunderous theology about grace and faith. No long looping sentences weaving salvation out of metaphor and mystery. Just the apostles. Just their memories. Just Jesus. Now ask yourself, what would that gospel look like? For much of modern Christianity, Paul is the loudest voice in the room. His letters make up a hefty chunk of the New Testament. His interpretation of Jesus has shaped creeds, sermons, and centuries of thought. But Paul wasn't one of the 12. He never met Jesus in the flesh. His dramatic conversion happened later on a dusty road in a vision no one else could verify. And yet his voice somehow became louder than theirs. If there was a gospel of the 12, it almost certainly did not include Paul's perspective. And that silence, Paul's absence, may be the very reason it vanished. The early church didn't evolve in a vacuum. It emerged from tension between Jerusalem and Antioch, between Peter and Paul, between Jewish tradition and Gentile expansion. In the book of Acts, we glimpse polite versions of those tensions. In Paul's own letters, the edges are sharper. He clashes with those who seem to be pillars. He defends his gospel against accusations of deviation. He insists again and again that he received his message not from men, but from revelation. So imagine a text, old, foundational, revered, written by the 12, and excluding everything Paul would later teach. No justification by faith apart from works. No sharp break from the law. No mystical union with Christ through death and resurrection metaphors. Just the teachings of Jesus as remembered by his disciples. What would that do to Paul's authority? What would that do to the narrative? It would split it wide open. There's an obscure but telling reference in the Epistle of the Apostles, a 2nd century text we brushed against earlier. It reads almost like a rebuttal to Paul. It emphasizes communal unity, bodily resurrection, and adherence to the teachings the apostles received directly from Jesus. It reads like a memory trying not to be forgotten. Some scholars believe it was composed specifically to counter Pauline influence. And in the Pseudo-Clementines, which we've already walked through, Paul appears in thin disguise, challenged, undermined, subtly portrayed as a false teacher. The character Simon in the narrative often interpreted as a stand-in for Paul preaches a gospel not recognized by Peter. Again and again, the message is the same: the 12 received the truth, and others have distorted it. If these scattered texts are crumbs from the same vanished loaf, then perhaps the gospel of the 12 was the centerpiece of a tradition that saw Paul not as an apostle, but as a detour. A later voice powerful, but not foundational. Which brings us to the heart of the danger. A Christianity rooted solely in the 12 would have looked radically different. It may have remained closer to Judaism. It may have retained practices like Sabbath observance, dietary laws, temple pilgrimage. Jesus would be seen not as abolishing the law, but fulfilling it without removing it. It may also have emphasized behavior over belief, ethics over metaphysics. A kingdom of God coming soon, not through Rome's conversion, but through the return of a teacher who never claimed to be God. Such a gospel would be ill-suited for an expanding Gentile-dominated church. It would be too narrow, too tribal, too hard to universalize. Paul, for all his abrasiveness, offered a more adaptable message: grace over law spirit, over letter inclusion, over restriction. And so the gospel of the 12, if it existed, faced a problem of relevance, not in its own time, but in the time that followed. As Christianity grew, it chose the version of the story that traveled well, the version that made friends with Greek philosophy, the version that could become Roman. There's no smoking scroll to prove any of this, but the silence again speaks volumes. We have no gospel signed by the 12. We have no consistent apostolic writing outside Paul's letters and the anonymous gospels attributed to Matthew and John. And yet, the early church insisted on the authority of the 12. Why exalt their names, then erase their words, unless those words preserved in some now lost gospel no longer fit the script? What would it have meant to canonize a gospel without Paul's theology? What would it have meant to center Christianity not on a revelation received in isolation, but on a memory shared around a table? It would have meant a different faith entirely. And maybe, just maybe, that's why that gospel had to go. Close your eyes and picture it. An old scroll, faded at the edges, passed from calloused hand to trembling hand. Its words aren't lofty or poetic. They aren't abstract theology. They're memories, simple, uneven, true. A voice says, "He was there, we were all there. Now open your eyes." That scroll, we never found it. But traces of it shimmer between the lines of ancient commentary, like a tune barely remembered. And in the early Christian world, this tune was known vaguely, mysteriously, as the Apostolic memoirs. The phrase appears again and again in the writings of the 2nd century. Justin Martyr uses it when describing the Gospels that were read aloud in worship gatherings. He says the memoirs of the apostles and the writings of the prophets are read. But here's where it gets slippery. Justin never names which Gospels he means. He doesn't say Matthew or Luke. He says memoirs, memories. Sometimes the memoirs composed by the apostles of Christ and those who followed them. It's vague enough to comfort orthodoxy, but specific enough to raise questions. What were these memoirs? Were they early versions of our canonical Gospels, raw drafts before the final edits? Were they a separate, now lost text? Or were they something else entirely, a unified gospel remembered and composed by the 12? Some scholars argue that Justin's phrasing points toward a proto-gospel possibly circulating in his time, known and revered, but not yet fully canonical. He describes passages we can match to Matthew and Luke, but often with variations, wordings that don't appear in any of our known manuscripts. Either Justin was quoting from memory or from something no longer in our possession. Others have wondered whether apostolic memoirs was a polite umbrella term used to avoid controversy. In a time when multiple gospel texts floated freely, some considered orthodox, others heretical, it would have been safer to refer to memoirs rather than commit to a particular version. It allowed the listener to project familiarity while the speaker preserved ambiguity. But what if Justin's memoirs weren't plural in origin? What if they were fragments from a single source? A shared apostolic record written by those who had walked with Jesus, or at least closely preserved their oral tradition. If the Gospel of the 12 existed, this is exactly how it might have survived, as memoirs quietly read aloud, gradually dissected their pieces, absorbed into later Gospels, their identity forgotten. There's a strange pattern that shows up here. Whenever early writers refer to the authority of the apostles, they tend to emphasize memory over invention. Papias, writing not long after Justin, says he preferred oral tradition because it was fresher, more direct. He trusted what he had heard from those who had heard from the apostles. Again, no mention of Paul's letters. No exaltation of theological treatises, just stories, anecdotes, eyewitness accounts, memoirs. Even Irenaeus, champion of orthodoxy, enforcer of the fourfold gospel, relies heavily on the authority of apostolic succession. He doesn't always specify which texts the apostles supposedly handed down. He just insists that their teachings were preserved somewhere. And this insistence raises a troubling question: why the need to assert so strongly that apostolic tradition was intact, unless it was already fragmenting? And if it was fragmenting, what was being lost? You begin to feel the quiet possibility the Gospel of the 12 may have bled into the apostolic memoirs, and the memoirs into the canon, until all that remained was echo. You can almost see it like an overpainted fresco, original outlines, barely visible beneath a newer surface. What if the Gospel of the 12 wasn't erased all at once? What if it was absorbed, quoted without attribution, modified for clarity, reworded for theology? Its stories scattered like seeds growing under new names in new soil until no one remembered where they came from. This is how memory works. It survives not through purity, but through transformation, through repetition, through adaptation, through forgetting just enough. So maybe Justin wasn't being vague at all. Maybe Memoirs of the Apostles was his reverent way of referencing a tradition already fading, a gospel that once bore the voice of the 12, now recited in fragments, its origin no longer safe to speak aloud. A gospel remembered, but no longer known. The name alone sounds like a footnote, the Gospel of the Nazarenes. Not a headline, not a threat. Just another curiosity filed away in dusty commentaries. But whisper it softly, and it opens a door, a narrow one hidden behind the walls of orthodoxy, leading to a world where Jesus still speaks Aramaic, where the apostles still walk Jewish soil, and where a gospel from the 12 may have left its last surviving echoes. The Nazarenes were one of several Jewish Christian groups lingering in the shadows of early church history. Not quite Gentile, not quite rabbinic, they lived in the in-between. Scholars have debated endlessly whether the Nazarenes were a distinct sect, a transitional identity, or just another name for the Ebionites. But whatever their classification, one thing is clear: they used a gospel. And it wasn't Mark or John or anything found in the codices copied in Constantinople. This gospel, known to later commentators as the Gospel of the Nazarenes, was written in Hebrew or Aramaic, depending on which church father you believe, and it had passages that both overlapped with and diverged from the Gospel of Matthew. Jerome, the irritable genius who gave us the Latin Vulgate, claimed to have read it. He described it as resembling Matthew, but with key differences. A version of Matthew, he said, according to the Hebrews. Now pause. Breathe. That phrasing alone opens the floodgates of speculation. Because early tradition claims that Matthew wrote a gospel in the Hebrew language. No copy of it survives, but Jerome believed the Gospel of the Nazarenes might be that original version. So what if, just what if, that Hebrew Matthew wasn't written by Matthew alone? What if it was a collective work drawn from the teachings and memories of the 12, and preserved by those Jewish Christian communities that never abandoned their roots? Consider the fragments we have. In one, Jesus responds to the rich man, not with the line from canonical Matthew, "If you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions," but with a softer, more communal phrase, "Do not be angry and do not lust, and love your neighbor as yourself." It feels like advice from someone who ate with you, not someone forming doctrine. It feels apostolic. Another fragment has Jesus say, "Even if your brother sins with a word and makes amends, receive him 7 times a day." That phrasing, absent from the canonical Gospels, echoes the kind of ethics one might expect from a text grounded not in abstract theology, but in lived community, in shared meals, in actual reconciliation. The Nazarenes, like the Ebionites, followed the law. They kept Sabbath. They honored the temple traditions even as they followed Jesus. Their gospel reflected this blend, rooted in Judaism, yet centered on the messianic role of Christ. And unlike the Gospels, we know theirs made no room for virgin births, pre-existent divinity, or cosmic language. In other words, it may have preserved a memory older than theology, a voice before creeds. It's not hard to imagine how such a gospel could be descended from a common source, something like the Gospel of the 12. Not necessarily a direct copy, but a living branch from the same tree, passed down by those who refused to forget where it started. And maybe that's why the Church let it wither. By the time of Jerome and Epiphanius, the Gospel of the Nazarenes was already relegated to the margins. They read it, translated parts of it, criticized it, and then moved on. No official condemnation, just a slow fade into irrelevance. That's how dangerous texts often disappear. Not in flames, but in footnotes. But even in those footnotes, something lingers. A tone, a simplicity. A portrait of Jesus, less grand, more grounded. A man whose teachings were practical, human, and insistent on righteousness over ritual. This gospel doesn't thunder, it hums. And in its quiet harmony, you might catch the chorus of 12 men who walked dusty roads, watched fish roast over coals, and believed perhaps naively that the kingdom of God would come in their lifetime. If the gospel of the 12 ever existed, its ghost may still walk inside the gospel of the Nazarenes, not visible at first glance, but in the corners, in the syntax, in the smell of loaves and olives on a hillside, and in the gentle insistence that Jesus didn't come to destroy anything, but to remind them of what they'd forgotten. You've heard the phrase before canon formation, and maybe it sounds like a scholarly chore. Committees in robes, scrolls on tables, quiet monks voting on sacred sentences. But the reality was bloodier, sharper, messier, because the formation of the Christian canon wasn't a peaceful process of discernment, it was a battle. And like all battles, it had casualties. One of them may have been the Gospel of the 12. By the 4th century, Christianity had moved from underground catacombs to basilicas adorned in imperial marble. Constantine had legalized the faith. Bishops now wielded political power, and theology, once the domain of wandering teachers and letters passed in secret, had become the sharp edge of imperial unity. But unity demanded something dangerous: selection. What to keep, what to burn, what to forget. And this wasn't about content alone. It was about control. Different regions had different gospels. Syria had Tatian's Diatessaron. Egypt had the Gospel of Thomas. Rome preferred Luke and Paul. The churches in Palestine still clung to more Jewish forms of faith. Each text carried not just theology, but identity. To choose a gospel was to choose a future. The councils didn't begin as democratic forums. They began as damage control. Heresies had exploded across the empire: Gnosticism, Marcionism, Montanism. And the response wasn't just to argue, but to codify, fix the story, seal the canon. Enter Athanasius of Alexandria. In the year 367 CE, he issued a festal letter that for the first time listed the 27 books of the New Testament as we now know them. No more, no less. That list was later affirmed by councils in Hippo and Carthage. But the question rises, what got left out and why? There is no mention of the Gospel of the 12. No condemnation, no defense, not even a passing reference. And yet earlier writers Origen Epiphanius had named it. It wasn't unknown, it was ignored. And in the world of canon politics, silence is rarely accidental. Because if there had been a gospel written by the 12 as a group, it would have overridden every other gospel. Every Pauline epistle, every apostolic letter. It would have changed everything. Its authority would have been untouchable, its contents unchallengeable. Unless, of course, its contents were inconvenient. What if the Gospel of the 12 taught that Jesus came not to start a new religion, but to reform Judaism? What if it portrayed him as human, prophetic, law-keeping, radically ethical, but not metaphysically divine? What if it supported James over Paul, Jerusalem over Rome? You begin to understand. A gospel like that couldn't be debated. It had to be erased. Canon politics operated under the banner of orthodoxy, but beneath that banner flowed rivers of rivalry. Different bishops championed different texts. Regional power struggled against imperial mandates. Some texts were edited to align with new doctrines. Others, like the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of the Egyptians, were condemned outright. But a gospel from the 12 that would have required an entirely new theology. And new theology was not what the Church wanted. It wanted finality, stability, creed. The Nicene Creed, hammered out in 325 CE, had already locked in the language of divine sonship, begotten, not made of one substance with the Father. The canon needed to reflect that. Anything earlier, messier, more Semitic, it didn't fit. So imagine a gospel, old, authentic, deeply rooted, that described Jesus walking among his people, teaching them the kingdom, upholding the law, resisting Rome, dying unjustly, rising mysteriously, but never claiming to be God. That gospel couldn't be argued away. So it was ignored into oblivion. And here's the darker twist. The canon was not a single moment, it was a process. Over decades, maybe centuries, books were copied, traded, cited. The ones that got used survived. The ones that got sidelined faded. The Gospel of the 12 didn't need to be publicly banned. It only needed to be privately shelved. Think of it like a painting removed from a gallery. The frame is intact. The lighting is still there. But the art is gone. Visitors stop asking. New paintings take its place. And soon no one remembers what used to hang there. Canon formation wasn't just about choosing what was true. It was about choosing what was useful, what could unify, what could survive under empire. And in that process, the Gospel of the 12 may have been too early, too Jewish, too unruly. So it became something the Church could no longer name. Now step softly. The air grows charged here, thick with what-ifs, heavy with implications. Because it's one thing to suggest that a gospel was lost. It's another to ask why. And the answer may not lie in manuscript decay or historical accident. It may lie in something far more volatile: ideology. The early church didn't just canonize texts, it canonized allegiances. To Jesus, yes, but also to an interpretation of him. the Jesus of the creeds, the cosmic Christ of the councils, Son of God, born of a virgin, equal to the Father, fully divine, eternally begotten. But was that how the 12 first understood him? Or did they believe in a Jesus closer to earth than heaven anointed, not born divine, a teacher, not a metaphysical force? If the gospel of the 12 ever existed, it may not have been rejected for being false. It may have been rejected for being true to a version of Jesus that no longer served the church's vision. Let's trace the tension. By the time of the 3rd century, Christianity had begun absorbing elements of Greco-Roman philosophy, logos theology from the Stoics, dualism from the Platonists, even Gnostic flavors of light versus darkness. Jesus was no longer simply a Jewish prophet. He was the pre-existent Word, co-creator of the cosmos, a being whose human life was almost incidental to his eternal role. But what if the earliest gospel didn't teach that? What if it portrayed Jesus as chosen, yes, but chosen by God at baptism, not born of divine substance? What if it emphasized his fidelity to Torah, his opposition to corruption, his message of repentance and justice? That kind of gospel would have felt not just outdated, it would have felt rebellious. To revere such a text would be an act of resistance, a threat. You see this played out in the Church's treatment of groups that clung to Jewish Christian roots. The Ebionites, the Nazarenes, they weren't dismissed merely for bad doctrine. They were accused of being stubborn, of refusing to progress, of honoring the law when grace had supposedly replaced it. Their problem wasn't heresy, it was allegiance. And that's the question the Gospel of the 12 would have raised. Whose Jesus are we following, the man of Nazareth or the Christ of Nicaea? This was not a mild difference. It was theological warfare. If Jesus was purely human, then salvation was moral, not mystical. If he taught adherence to the law, then Paul's teachings needed re-examination. If he emphasized collective memory over private revelation, then entire systems of spiritual authority began to wobble. And here's where the silence becomes screaming. The idea of a gospel jointly authored or preserved by the 12 would have carried enormous weight. Too much weight. It would have forced bishops to answer to fishermen, theologians to defer to memory, empire to bend to ethics. So what do you do with a text like that? You cannot destroy it too loudly. That would make martyrs. You cannot canonize it without rewriting everything. So you do the only thing left. You smother it. You separate it into parts, assigning pieces to more manageable texts. You cite it vaguely as memoirs, as tradition, as used by heretics. You never mention it again. That's how a gospel goes from allegiance to anathema. It may still haunt the corners of other writings. It may breathe faintly in the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Pseudo-Clementines, even the earliest sayings traditions. But its voice, its full unified voice, has been silenced, not because it was confusing, but because it was clear, too clear. It told the story before the spin, and so you're left here centuries later reading the space between texts, listening to the echoes, tracing a gospel that no one will admit existed, and wondering, was it lost because it was wrong, or because it was right, and too many powerful people couldn't afford to follow it? It begins with a whisper, no narrative, no nativity, just a line. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. That's how the Gospel of Thomas opens, like a door cracked open in a dark corridor, offering not a story, but a mirror. A list of sayings, 114 of them preserved in Coptic, discovered in the Egyptian sands near Nag Hammadi in 1945. And ever since, this strange, silent text has unsettled scholars, mystics, and skeptics alike. But if you read it slowly without the need to categorize or condemn it, begins to hum with something familiar. Not familiar in doctrine, familiar in tone, in rhythm. In the echo of a teacher's voice repeating ideas to a circle of students who knew him personally, not decades later. But then, and you begin to wonder, was the Gospel of Thomas a rival to the Gospel of the 12, or its reflection? At first glance, the two couldn't seem more different. The Gospel of Thomas is fragmented, meditative, esoteric. The Gospel of the 12, if it existed, is imagined as a unified narrative, possibly structured, communal, and rooted in memory. But peel back the categories, and the overlap becomes harder to ignore. Both texts are pointedly apostolic. Thomas claims direct authorship. The Gospel of the 12 is said to be authored collectively. Both are devoid of Pauline theology. Neither make use of creeds, virgin births, or Trinitarian formulas. Both seem to draw from an oral tradition, a Jesus who speaks in parables and paradoxes, not epistles and systems. There's a particular line in Thomas saying 13, where Jesus asks the disciples, "Compare me to someone and tell me who I am like." They answer with titles and roles. But Thomas stays silent. Later, Jesus whispers something to him. The others demand to know what it was, but Jesus laughs and says, "If I told you what he said, you would pick up stones and throw them at me." It's cryptic, but it pulses with tension. A secret teaching, a private message, a moment that feels too honest for the polished Gospels, a fragment of something not meant for wide release. And that may be the key. If the Gospel of the 12 contained the raw sayings of Jesus before theological editing, it may have looked a lot more like Thomas than like Luke. A collection of teachings passed among the 12, eventually reframed or redacted, or simply lost. Some scholars argue that Thomas preserved an early independent strand of Jesus' voice. Others insist it was written later, influenced by Gnostic thinking. But the sayings themselves are hard to dismiss. Many mirror or echo lines found in Matthew and Luke, but often they're sharper, earthier, closer to the dirt. The kingdom of God is within you. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. Blessed is the lion whom a man eats, so the lion becomes human. Strange, yes, but there's a rhythm here, one that feels like it came from someone remembering, not inventing. And this rhythm is what gives pause. Because if the 12 really did write or preserve a gospel, it would have sounded more like that. Less systematic, more personal. The canonical Gospels were likely written decades after Jesus' death. They carry layers, tradition, interpretation, adaptation. But Thomas feels like a voice unfiltered, as if someone scribbled these sayings down by firelight while the 12 still walked the earth. Is it the Gospel of the 12? No. But it might be something like its echo, or maybe its sibling. What complicates matters further is how Thomas was treated. It wasn't preserved in any canonical list. It was hidden, buried in the desert. And that tells us something. Because dangerous texts aren't buried for being dull. They're buried for being too close to the source. Thomas, in its quiet defiance, invites the reader to seek, to look within, to find the kingdom not in a creed, but in the tension between knowing and not knowing. And that might have been the same tension the 12 felt in the days after Jesus was gone. So was Thomas a rival gospel, maybe? Or maybe it was a mirror reflecting the fragments left over when the Gospel of the 12 was dismantled, scattered, and forgotten. And as you rest now in the silence after the sayings, ask yourself not what was lost, but what still lingers. What have we remembered without realizing it? What voices still speak in the quiet when doctrine goes to sleep? You've walked beside heretics and hermits. You've listened to whispers in Origen's commentaries, traced outlines in Eusebius's lists, and followed the footprints of forgotten gospels across the dusty margins of theology. Now the path leads you to a man who tried to close the door, who tried to fix the number of gospels to 4 and only 4 and silence everything else. His name was Irenaeus. He lived in the late 2nd century, writing in a time when Christianity was still trying to decide what counted as truth. The boundaries were porous, the canon unfixed, and into that swirl Irenaeus hurled his most famous work against heresies. A sprawling, meticulous, often angry book that names names, tears down rival teachings, and draws thick lines between orthodoxy and deviation. It's here among his pages that we find what's not there. He never mentions the Gospel of the 12. This is a man who catalogued heretical gospels with relentless precision. The Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Mary. He calls out the Valentinians, the Scythians, the followers of Marcion. He mocks them, corrects them sometimes with scholarly patience, sometimes with something close to fury. He lists the canonical Gospels as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and claims that there can only be 4, just as there are 4 winds, 4 corners of the earth, 4 pillars holding up the heavens. He wasn't just affirming a number, he was building a theology of containment. But he says nothing about the Gospel of the 12. Why the omission is deafening. He knew of Origen. He would have known of the texts condemned by others, and he was obsessed with apostolic authority. That was his whole platform: apostolic succession, apostolic teaching, apostolic memory. He traced the teachings of the Church back to the 12 like a chain of custody, so why not mention a gospel that allegedly bore their name? Some argue that the silence proves the Gospel of the 12 never existed, but that logic is brittle, because Irenaeus doesn't just write to catalog, he writes to control, to shape a narrative, and if there was a text floating in some region that challenged Paul, questioned the divinity of Jesus, or presented a more Jewish, earthly version of the Messiah, that kind of gospel wouldn't just be heretical. It would be politically unmanageable. Perhaps he chose not to mention it, for the same reason a government doesn't publicize a leak it can't plug. Better to pretend it doesn't exist. Better to discredit it by silence. Or perhaps the Gospel of the 12 had already become a seedbed for other dangerous teachings. We've seen traces in the Ebionites, the Nazarenes, even in Thomas. If Irenaeus viewed those groups as dangerous enough on their own, he may have seen no value in naming their possible source, especially one that would carry the unbearable weight of 12 signatures. There's also the problem of authority. Irenaeus claimed apostolic tradition, but he never claimed access to any direct writings of the 12, aside from those wrapped in canonical gospels. If a gospel of the 12 existed and contradicted the emerging narrative of the divine Christ, born of a virgin, crucified, and risen as cosmic savior, then it couldn't be acknowledged. Not without collapsing the structure Irenaeus was building. So he built around it. And in doing so may have contributed to its disappearance. It's also worth noting that against heresies has come down to us through the channels of the victorious Church. What survived did so because it was copied. What was copied was what the Church wanted remembered. If Irenaeus ever wrote about the Gospel of the 12, it may have been edited out, snipped from a manuscript, by a monk who knew exactly what needed to be preserved and what needed to be protected. Because silence is not always absence. Sometimes silence is the sound of someone closing a door. You imagine Irenaeus at his desk, parchment before him, ink on his fingers, quill hovering over a name he's not sure he should write. A gospel said to be authored by the 12. Too early to be dismissed. Too dangerous to be defended. Too real to be allowed to speak. so he doesn't write it. And in doing so, he helps erase it. But even now, even here, the absence glows, because what he wouldn't say still says something, and you're still listening. There's a peculiar shift in tone that happens when you move from the Gospels to the Acts of the Apostles. You feel it as a drop in temperature, a narrowing of the lens. In the Gospels, the 12 are front and center. They're chosen, rebuked, shaped, broken, and finally commissioned. They walk with Jesus, eat with him, flee from him, and find him again. But once you enter Acts, the so-called sequel, the focus drifts. The 12 begin to fade. Peter opens with a fiery speech. James gets a few weighty nods. But the rest, they slip into the background, becoming shadows in their own story. The book is called Acts, but it might as well be called Paul. Why, this isn't just narrative evolution. It's theological strategy. The Gospels need the 12. They give weight to Jesus' ministry, grounding him in community, in continuity, in witness. But Acts was written in a different moment, when the church had begun to expand far beyond its Jewish roots, and Paul had emerged as the voice of that expansion. So what happens to the 12? They become the scaffolding that holds up the early church, and then they disappear. And this quiet disappearance raises a troubling question. If the 12 were the direct witnesses of Jesus, if they had walked with him, learned from him, eaten beside him for years, why don't we hear more from them after the resurrection? Where are their writings? Where are their teachings, their sermons, their disputes, their leadership? Unless, of course, they were written. Unless their voices once rang out through a gospel that bore their name. And that gospel, for reasons we've been tracing, was removed. In the Gospels, the 12 are everywhere. They question. They misunderstand. They see miracles and still doubt. That rawness feels honest. Lived in. Human. But in Acts, their presence becomes clean, symbolic. Peter leads. James presides. The others dissolve. And then Paul enters. With his letters, his journeys, his revelations. He wasn't there for the Sermon on the Mount. He didn't see the loaves multiply or the blind regain sight. But he gets more ink than any of them. His voice becomes the architecture of the new faith. And yet Paul himself acknowledges the 12, calls them pillars, admits their prior claim to the movement. But you can feel the tension in his letters. He defends his apostleship constantly, as if someone kept questioning it. Who was questioning it? Maybe the ones who had known Jesus face to face. Maybe the ones whose version of the gospel was different, too grounded, too ethical, too unwilling to let go of the law. And maybe, just maybe, they once wrote it down. Together. If the gospel of the 12 existed, it would have provided a counterweight to Paul's theological dominance, not to erase his voice, but to balance it. To remind the growing church that the man they followed was not just a symbol, but a person. That his teachings were not abstract propositions, but instructions for a way of life. But that balance never came. Or if it did, it was lost. The gospel of the 12, if real, would have preserved that missing dimension, a collective memory unshaped by empire or theology. And its disappearance fits the pattern. Because by the time the canon solidified, the narrative of the 12 had already been sanitized. They became names on a list, apostles in a creed, icons in stained glass. But their voices together went silent. Acts gives us glimpses, brief moments. But the central narrative moves elsewhere, to Paul, to expansion, to Rome. And so the gospel of community becomes a gospel of conversion. The message of the kingdom becomes the machinery of doctrine. What was lost in that transition may be the gospel of the 12, maybe the voice of the first followers, raw, unfiltered human. And maybe that loss wasn't accidental. Maybe it was necessary. For the new church to rise, the old one had to be buried. Now the path grows stranger. The names are familiar, Peter, John, Thomas, Andrew, but the stories are not. These are not the apostles you remember from Sunday school. These are miracle-working mystics, wandering ascetics, visionaries, with talking animals, levitating crosses, and cosmic revelations. Welcome to the Apocryphal Acts, a genre that never made it into the canon, but one that may hold whispers of something older than the canon itself. At first glance, these texts read like early Christian fan fiction. The Acts of Peter has him challenging Simon Magus to a supernatural duel. The Acts of Thomas sends the apostle to India, where he baptizes royalty, preaches chastity, and is eventually martyred for disrupting a wedding. The Acts of Andrew wanders through allegory and asceticism so thick it feels like theology wrapped in poetry. They were dismissed by church authorities. Too strange, too speculative, too theatrical. And yet they survived, copied, treasured, retold in whispers. Why? Because beneath the mysticism, you begin to hear something else. A voice, a rhythm, a structure that feels older than the embroidery built around it. And that's where the theory begins to flicker. What if these acts, especially the earliest versions, preserved slivers of something real? Something shared, something that once belonged to the collective memory of the 12, not as doctrine, not as fully formed theology, but as story. Let's take Thomas, for example. The Acts of Thomas is one of the most complete apocryphal texts we have, and it's filled with mystery. But running through its elaborate visions and symbolic speeches is a simplicity that feels familiar teachings on humility, generosity, detachment from wealth. Jesus speaks through Thomas in sayings that echo not just the Gospel of Thomas, but sayings found nowhere else. Some scholars have argued that these words may reflect an early layer of tradition, one that wasn't filtered through Pauline theology or Greco-Roman logic. Or consider the Acts of Peter. Yes, Peter confronts a magician in a duel of miracles, and yes, he dies crucified upside down. But between the spectacle, there are long speeches, meditations even, that suggest a deeper concern. One where Peter isn't just a church leader, but a witness trying to convey something too big for prose. His teachings in the text often center on right action, the mystery of suffering, and the presence of God, not in thunder, but in silence. These are not the inventions of idle scribes. They feel remembered. Even the structural similarities between these acts are suggestive. Despite being written by different authors in different regions, they often follow a familiar arc. An apostle is sent out, preaches, performs wonders, faces resistance, teaches in secret, and is eventually killed. It's as if they were built around a shared memory, a blueprint that may have come from a lost source. If the Gospel of the 12 ever existed, these texts could be its aftershocks, not direct copies, not surviving manuscripts, but stories built on stories. Oral tradition poured into new wineskins, and just maybe preserved in these dramatic acts is a worldview rooted in the earliest version of the Jesus movement, a gospel centered not on Christology, but on action, on witness, on the echo of a man they followed, because he told the truth, not because he glowed in the dark. Even more curious is the absence of Paul. These acts rarely mention him. When they do, it's in passing. The heroes here are the original 12 now scattered across the earth, carrying a message that is remarkably consistent in tone, even when wrapped in local mythology. And that tone, it's intimate, pastoral, human, a Jesus who eats with sinners, not one who thunders from the sky. Apostles who doubt and suffer, not saints in gold leaf. These are not tales of conquest. They're stories of endurance, of memory. Could it be that these apocryphal acts, despite their fantastical layers, are preserving a thread of continuity, one that winds all the way back to the 12 and the gospel they may have once written together? That's the haunting possibility. And once you see it, it's hard to unsee. Because buried beneath the angels and visions and miracles is something quieter, a gospel still walking, still preaching, still bleeding through the cracks of history. Not a rival to canon, but a reminder. Picture a library, candlelit, quiet, stacked with scrolls both sacred and suspect. Somewhere deep in the archives lies a manuscript too old to ignore but too problematic to publish. A gospel bearing the authority of the 12 yet saying things the bishops no longer want heard. Now imagine a scribe tasked with copying the works of Origen or Clement. He pauses at a reference to a gospel used by heretics. A name appears, the Gospel of the 12. He hesitates, and then skips it. This is not an act of malice. It's self-preservation. Ecclesial fear has already done its work. By the 4th century, the Church had begun building what could only be described as a firewall, an intellectual barricade, against texts that didn't conform to emerging doctrine. Heresy wasn't just punished in the streets. It was erased in the scriptorium. And at the heart of this quiet censorship stood the patristic project, an informal but powerful effort by the Church Fathers to define, defend, and ultimately control which versions of Jesus would survive. This wasn't conspiracy. It was structure, self-defense. Men like Athanasius Cyril of Jerusalem and Gregory of Nyssa didn't just quote scripture. They curated it. They wrote lists of accepted books and warned readers about harmful writings. They didn't want the faithful confused by apocryphal gospels, Jewish versions of Jesus, or anything that contradicted the hard-won conclusions of the councils. And so a firewall was built, not of code, but of silence. It began with soft erasures, scribes omitting passages, bishops discouraging citation, libraries losing manuscripts during relocations that somehow always spared the canon. Then came harder measures, lists of forbidden books, condemnations from councils, public readings outlawed, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Nazarenes, the Gospel of Thomas, all pushed outside the walls. Not because they were unreadable, but because they were inconvenient. If the Gospel of the 12 ever circulated during this period, it would have faced a triple threat. First, theological. If it presented Jesus as fully human, deeply Jewish, and not metaphysically divine, it would have clashed violently with the Nicene Creed, which by now declared him begotten, not made of one substance with the Father. Second, ecclesial. If it emphasized the authority of the original disciples over later bishops or over Paul's letters, it would have disrupted the succession model upon which episcopal authority rested. A gospel that prioritized the voice of the 12 without filters might undermine the very hierarchies the Church had built. Third, canonical. By the 4th century, the number of acceptable gospels was closed. 4. Just 4. No more. Any new or rediscovered gospel wasn't just redundant, it was dangerous. So the firewall stood. Church fathers didn't always burn what they feared. They often just refused to speak of it. Eusebius calls the Gospel of Peter heretical, but gives no excerpts. Irenaeus names the Gospel of Truth, but avoids explaining it. In the case of the Gospel of the 12, even the mention fades after Origen and Epiphanius, the name disappears from the record. But texts don't vanish without cause. They vanish with help. And fear, especially ecclesial fear, is a powerful motivator. The fear that people might start reading the wrong gospel, that priests might question their training, that doctrine might unravel like threads pulled too far from the center. This fear wasn't just theoretical. Remember the Montanists, who believed the Holy Spirit still spoke through prophets, or the Arians who questioned the divinity of Jesus, or the Donatists who believed the Church had been corrupted by collaboration with empire. All of them challenged central authority, and all of them were silenced not just with arguments, but with deletions. In that climate, the Gospel of the 12 couldn't survive. Not in full. Not under its name. It was either dismembered and absorbed, or hidden and forgotten. But the very need to suppress it tells us something. That such a gospel existed, that it mattered, that its voice, if truly authored by the 12, was too loud to leave unchallenged. So the Church responded not with rebuttal, but with absence. And in that absence, the firewall still hums. Now breathe. The journey has been long, the shadows thick, the questions sharper than the answers. And yet, after all the echoes, omissions, fragments, and silences, one haunting possibility lingers. What if the Gospel of the 12 were found today, complete, intact, undeniable? What would it do? The academic world would convulse. Theologians would scramble. Some would dismiss it immediately, too late, too fringe, too Jewish. Others would call for cautious study, for context, for endless footnotes. But beneath the scholarship, something seismic would begin to stir. Because if the Gospel bore real traces of the 12 linguistic patterns, names, teachings aligned with first-century Galilean culture, then all of Christian history would begin to shift on its axis. Imagine a gospel with no virgin birth, no Pauline grace formulas, a Jesus who speaks plainly, not in cosmic riddles, a Messiah who points not to Rome, but to the marginalized, a message centered not on belief in his divinity, but on following his teachings: love your enemy, share your bread, give without expecting return. The first shock would be textual. Doctrinal debates would ignite like dry leaves. Was Jesus ever meant to be God? Was Paul wrong? Was Christianity supposed to become a Gentile religion at all? The walls would begin to shake, not because the text was destructive, but because it might be original. Then would come the deeper tremor, the moral one. If the 12 really did record their memory of Jesus, and it focused on ethics, justice, humility, Torah, faithfulness, then what does that say about the Church's long obsession with metaphysics over mercy? What does that say about centuries of doctrine forged in the halls of empire? And deeper still, the spiritual tremor. People around the world, millions raised in a particular image of Christ, might suddenly be forced to reimagine him, not as the second person of a divine trinity, but as a prophet of urgent love, as a teacher of disruptive kindness, as someone who didn't just die for your sins, but taught you how to live in a way that made sin irrelevant. Some would cling tighter to their traditions. Others would feel liberated. Still others would feel betrayed. Why was this hidden? Who decided to erase it? And yet some would feel something even stranger. Not surprise, not outrage, but recognition. Because the Jesus of the Gospel of the 12, if he spoke from the dust of that lost manuscript, might not sound new at all. He might sound familiar. The voice you heard when you were still. The one that said, feed them, forgive them, try again. The one who never needed a title to be followed. It's tempting to think a discovery like that would shake the world, but maybe it would do something gentler. Maybe it would bring things back into balance. Remind the Church that its foundation was never built on councils or emperors, but on the memory of a man and the 12 friends who followed him, not because they understood him, but because they loved him. Maybe the Gospel of the 12, if it ever rises from the ashes, won't burn the house down. Maybe it will simply open a window. We're nearly at the edge now, the place where history gives way to possibility, and possibility gives way to silence. But before we close the last book, we have to open the latest ones. Because though centuries of firewalls, councils, and redacted memories have kept the Gospel of the 12 buried, the search hasn't stopped. It just changed clothes. Modern scholarship doesn't always make headlines. It works quietly among manuscripts, marginalia, computer models, linguistic reconstructions. The big discoveries like the Nag Hammadi texts or the Dead Sea Scrolls tend to steal the spotlight. But the real work often happens in the background. And for decades, that work has returned again and again to the same haunting puzzle: were there early written traditions that predated or paralleled the canonical Gospels? And if so, where did they go? It begins with patterns. Scholars like John Kloppenborg and Burton Mack notice that certain sayings in Matthew and Luke, those not found in Mark, follow a rhythm, a vocabulary, a logic distinct from the rest. This led to renewed interest in Q, the hypothetical saying source. But Q isn't the only ghost in the room. There's M and L terms used for material unique to Matthew or Luke. Each of these designations gestures towards something earlier, more raw. Possibly oral, possibly textual, possibly apostolic. The Gospel of the 12 rarely appears by name in scholarly databases, but it appears in disguise, as early Palestinian source material, as Jewish Christian tradition, as non-Pauline primitive theology. Every time a researcher uncovers a phrase that feels older than the document it sits in, or a story that seems to contradict the later theology surrounding it, the unspoken question rises: where did this come from? And then there's the forensic approach. In recent decades, scholars have begun using digital stylometry, statistical analysis of word patterns, to trace textual origins. By examining syntax, vocabulary, and stylistic fingerprints, they try to determine how different Gospels may have drawn from earlier sources. Some of these reconstructions suggest the existence of a sayings collection written in Aramaic, possibly rooted in the teachings of the earliest community in Jerusalem. But it's not just the words that matter, it's who used them and where. Fragments from the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Ebionites, and the Gospel of the Nazarenes have been collected, compared, and sorted like ancient bones. When laid side by side, they reveal a remarkably consistent picture of a Jesus who taught ethical action, upheld the law, and deferred all power to the God of Israel. A human Messiah, not metaphysical, not imperial, not Greek. And scholars are beginning to ask with more courage than before if these similarities point to a shared source. Some believe that source could have been oral, a communal memory passed among the apostles before it was ever written down. Others suggest it may have been textual, a gospel composed by the 12, or at least in their name, used by early Jewish Christian communities and later suppressed. What makes this line of inquiry so difficult is that the evidence is always circumstantial. The Gospel of the 12 as a named document has not been found, but its fingerprints keep showing up on glass. In 2022, a team at a European university published a paper on the thematic overlaps between non-canonical Gospels and the Didache, an early Christian teaching manual. Their conclusion that there once existed a unified source of ethical sayings, possibly apostolic, that shaped early communities before the rise of orthodox doctrine. They didn't call it the Gospel of the 12, but the shape fits. And in the ongoing digitization of ancient texts, new connections are being made. Marginal notes, once illegible, are now being re-examined under multispectral imaging. Faded ink reveals phrases that hint at lost Gospels according to the 12, or as was taught by them, buried beneath centuries of overwriting. Of course, mainstream institutions remain cautious. The idea of a lost gospel attributed to all 12 apostles remains speculative. To acknowledge its possible existence is to open a door many would rather keep closed, not out of malice but out of fear of instability. Doctrine likes certainty. The gospel of the 12, if it ever existed, offers none. But the search continues, quietly. In Hebrew grammar analysis, in archaeological digs, in the metadata of Coptic manuscripts, and perhaps most importantly, in hearts unsettled by the way things have always been explained. Because the real power of the gospel of the 12 isn't just in whether it existed. It's in what it represents: a Jesus movement rooted in memory, not theology, in community, not creed. And even now, as you sit in the quiet, the scholars are still looking, not for proof, but for fragments, for patterns, for the faintest breath of a gospel once carried by 12 voices, too early for doctrine, too real for dogma, and maybe too honest to survive. Now you see it. The shape that once hovered in the dark, like a rumor wrapped in fog, is starting to solidify. It's not just a gap in the historical record, not merely a missing page. It feels more like a carefully stitched wound, a silence so loud it disturbs the air around it. If the gospel of the 12 ever existed, and by now you've seen that the evidence, though indirect, is oddly consistent, then its disappearance isn't just a matter of chance. It begins to resemble something else entirely: a deliberate act, a targeted erasure. There are few things more dangerous to an emerging power structure than a version of truth it cannot control, especially when that version bears the names of those who walked beside the founder. By the 3rd century, Christianity was no longer just a movement, it was becoming a machine. Creeds were being codified, bishops elevated theological borders drawn with alarming precision. And just as a modern state edits its textbooks to craft national identity, the early church, particularly its dominant branches, began to finalize the story of Jesus. Not the full story, the usable story. Within this context, the idea of a gospel bearing the collective authority of the 12 becomes volatile. Imagine a text where Jesus speaks not in John's mysticism or Paul's cosmic hierarchy, but in the raw terrestrial voice of a Jewish teacher. A text that emphasizes action over belief, obedience over abstraction, community over orthodoxy. One written before Paul's letters had framed the terms before imperial Christianity wrapped the cross in gold leaf. Now imagine what such a gospel would do to a church already struggling with internal division, theological fragmentation, and the constant need to assert its legitimacy. It's not hard to see how the gospel of the 12, if it ever surfaced, would have been classified as a threat. Not necessarily a fraud, but worse, too authentic, too primitive, too early. Some scholars argue that the lack of direct references to the gospel is precisely the clue. If it had been named and condemned outright, it might have gained sympathy. But by quietly absorbing its echoes into safer texts like the Didache or the Gospel of the Hebrews, while excluding it from the canon, the Church neutralized its power without having to stage a trial. Like a political dissident made to vanish, it was not publicly executed. It simply stopped being mentioned. Origen's passing reference, Eusebius's carefully chosen categorization, the absence in the Muratorian canon, the scattered similarities in texts used by the Ebionites, the Nazarenes, and other now extinct communities, all of it begins to feel less like random noise and more like a suppressed melody. Consider how Paul, the dominant voice in Christian scripture, had little tolerance for competing apostolic perspectives. In Galatians, he asserts that even if an angel from heaven preached another gospel, it should be rejected. That's a bold position for someone who wasn't part of the 12. What if that other gospel wasn't just hypothetical? What if it already existed and had the names of the 12 attached to it? That would explain a great deal. It would explain the fierce centralization of doctrine, the hostility toward Jewish Christian sects, the obsession with false teachers in the pastoral epistles, the invisibility of the gospel of the 12 across generations of commentary. And more importantly, it would explain why so many scraps remain. Erasure is never perfect. Ideas leave residue. They echo. They return in dreams, in footnotes, in the marginalia of forbidden texts. They cling to oral traditions, to apocryphal stories, to communities that survive just long enough to pass the whispers along. The Gospel of the 12 was likely not just edited out. It was pulled out by the roots, with care, with fear, with intent. And yet here we are, piecing it back together not to resurrect a lost dogma, but to acknowledge the full shape of history. What happens if this theory is true? If the 12 really did leave behind a unified testimony, and it was buried to preserve a different narrative, the implications are enormous. Not just for theology, but for power, for history, for what gets remembered and what gets erased. And yet perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: it may never fully return. We may never hold the gospel of the 12 in our hands, but we can feel its presence in the places where it should be, like footprints around a fire that's long gone cold, and that more than anything suggests it mattered. So now you're left with the silence. The trail is ending. The voices have grown faint, like echoes drifting off into a cloistered dusk. The gospel of the 12, if it ever existed now, lives in shadows and whispers in the half-lit corridors of what might have been. But something remains. It's there in the strangely converging details, a footnote in origin, a pattern of sayings in the Gospel of the Hebrews, an awkward absence in Irenaeus's list of texts he loved to dissect. It's there in the small, deliberate decisions of canon makers, what to include, what to burn, and what to quietly ignore, until memory itself forgets to ask. What's left is not a book, not a scroll, nor even a line of text we can point to with certainty. What's left is a possibility, a presence, a question that refuses to die. What would a gospel sound like if written by all 12 before the creeds, before the councils, before theology had been drafted like a legal code? Would it be raw? Earthy? Would it smell of Galilean dust and sea salt and simple bread? Would it care more about how to live than what to believe? Would it challenge what we've accepted for centuries? Not because it contradicts the Gospels we know, but because it remembers something deeper, something harder to control. Maybe it still exists, hidden, misnamed, mistranslated, waiting in a box, forgotten in a monastery library. The ink faded, but the voice intact. Or maybe it was burned, torn, lost forever except in traces we barely recognize. Either way, it leaves a crack in the official story, a thin fracture through which the moonlight of speculation pours in. You followed the trail. You heard the echoes. You held the silence in your hands. And maybe, just maybe, you'll hear it again next time you read a gospel and feel something missing. Not an error, not a lie. Just a silence shaped like 12 voices. And now breathe. Let your thoughts slow. Let the candles go out one by one. You've wandered through dusty archives, crossed deserts of forgotten memory, and lingered at the threshold of vanished truth. There is no need to resolve it all tonight. Let the questions remain soft. Let the apostles rest. Let the fire die down. The secret may still be out there. But for now, Let sleep have you,